Welcome back. What we're going to be doing now is we're going to be looking at that hard drive that we installed, and we're going to be making a couple of partitions, creating a file system, and then we're going to mount or map those new file systems to some directories so that we can easily access them through the operating system. So to do that, first of all, we need to work out whether that hard drive has been installed, whether it actually did install properly when we physically installed it into the machine. Now, we did it virtually, but in normal circumstances, as I said before, you would be taking the covers off the machine, putting the hard drive in, attaching a cable, and then putting it all back together again. So assuming that we've done that, we're now going to go through the process of seeing that it actually is being picked up by the operating system. Now again, like anything, there are a couple of ways of doing that, but because we already have an idea of what it's called, we've talked about the naming convention with Linux and Ubuntu in particular, and SATA drives, and we know that we've installed a SATA drive. We can assume that it's actually going to be called SD something, and so we need to see whether that's happened. So to do that, we're just going to do a search on the file structure of the directory dev, and we know that there is an SDA there because we've looked at that before, and there it is. And if I add a star to the end of that, it should pick up on all the partitions. And so I've got my drive being SDA and partition 1, 2 and 5. 1 being my primary, 2 being my logical, and 5 will be my swap file. So we're going to do that same process, but we're actually going to do it on B. And there it is, it's installed. Fantastic. If I do a star on that, I get no reply, or I get no additional partitions because I haven't created them yet, and that's what I would expect. So the first program that I'm going to introduce you to is a program called Parted, and there are a couple of ways we can do this. Again, we can use fdisk, we can use other utilities. Fdisk and Parted seem to be the main ones that most people use. I'm going to use Parted for this exercise. You can use fdisk if you'd like, and to do that we need to go into sudo again, Parted, and we're now inside the program, and you can see that because the command prompt has disappeared and I've got this Parted in brackets, which means I'm working within the actual program itself. Okay, so because I didn't select the hard drive on the way in, I now need to do that, and I'm going to do that with the word select, and then I'm going to specify the device that I want to work with, so it's SDB, and I should get confirmation saying that I'm now using that secondary hard drive. Can't play around with the first hard drive because we're actually mounted and using that hard drive, but the second one is free and we can do whatever we want to it. So a few commands that you need to be aware of. The first one is print, and you'll see there that I've printed nothing to screen. Well, I don't have any partitions configured there at the moment, so I would expect that again. But if I were to change my hard drive that I'm looking at, so let's have a look at my first hard drive, and then I do a print, you'll see that there are my partitions, so that's good. I can also use the letter P, which will give me the same output, so P and print do exactly the same thing. So let's select that second hard drive again, and print, nothing there. Great. The second thing that I need to know, or the second command that I need to know within Parted, is the command mke2fs, and that's going to create the partitions for me. And so I can just type that at the command line. It'll give me prompts along the way, so I don't need to know everything or remember everything. The partition type, the first one's always got to be primary. After that I can create an extended if I want to, but we'll just do primary for both partitions. I'm going to create 2 partitions on this one hard drive. The file system type comes up as ext2 by default, and if I put ext, if I just hit enter, it should apply that. I'm going to discover that it probably won't, and I'll explain what we're going to do to rectify that, but for now, don't worry about it. The starting megabyte, this is in megabytes, so I'm going to put 1 as 1 meg being the first starting point, so at the beginning of the drive basically is what I'm saying there, and the end point. Now because this is a 8 gig hard drive, I'm going to create 2 partitions. I'm just going to go for a 3 gig or 3.5 gig drive for my first partition. No news is good news in Linux, and so that looks like it may have worked. Let's do a P to check it, and there it is there. Now have a look at the file system type at the end there. It says that it is ext4. Now I didn't specify that, and I'm not sure why that's doing that, but we don't need to worry too much about it because I'm going to override it in about a minute's time. Okay, so that's the first partition. I'm going to create a second partition now. Again, I'll make it primary. Again, I can leave that as the file system type ext2. Now the starting point, I can't create a partition on top of a partition, so this one's going to be starting point just after the finishing point of the first partition, so just over 3 gig, 3.5 gig I should say, and the finishing point, I don't know how big this hard drive is directly, so I'm just going to play it safe, and we'll go for a 7500. So 7 gig, 7.5 gig is my finishing point. So the partitions should be roughly 3.5 gig each. There you go. One's 4 gig, one's 3.5, and they've both come up as ext4. Now to confirm that, I'm going to override that in a moment, as I've just mentioned. Alright, so I can quit out of that. Back at the command line. The second utility that I want to introduce you to is a utility called mke2 file system, or FS. And this little utility allows me to create file systems from the command line, and I need to tell it what type of file system. So because they're both coming up in parted as ext4s, I'm just going to play around here a bit and see whether I can change it up. So I'm going to change the file system type to ext2, and we need to specify what partition we want to apply that to, and so the first partition, and looks like it may have worked. I'm going to do it to the second partition. That's good. No errors there, and so just to check that, I'm going to go back into parted. I'm going to print. Oops, forgot to select the right drive. Print, and now it's changed that file system type down to 2, so that's fine. So I'll quit out of that, and I'm just going to rerun that. We want to make it 4. Just don't have to do any of this, I'm just doing it to show you what you can do and sort of how it works. Hopefully it'll sink in, and done. Alright, so we've got our 2 partitions, and we've applied a file system to those 2 partitions, so effectively they're ready to go. I can use them, and I can write files, directories into those new areas of my server. However, for us to work with those effectively, we need to mount them, so you can't actually put anything into them until they've got a mount point. As I've explained, mounting is all about giving it that access, or an access point, to the directories, or to the files and directories that live within that partition. So most of our mount points are created automatically, and that's done through a file called fstab, or fstab, and it lives under the ECT directory. This what we're going to do now is we're actually going to manually mount these 2 new partitions, and before we do that we need to give it a directory that becomes a symbolic link to those new partitions. So let's do that now. mkdir for make directory, and we're going to put the new directory. I'm just going to put it straight on the root. I'm going to call it data. Now I'll need to be sudo to do that. I'll need to use sudo to do that. No news is good news. Downloads, no news is good news. So let's see if that's worked. ls / and now I've got two new directories, downloads and data. You can see them listed there. So once that's done, we can move on to mounting and look at mounting those two new directories, or symbolic, what are going to become a symbolic link. Before we do that though, let's see what's actually inside those directories, and you would imagine that there's nothing in there, and you would be right. So we can't see any files or data there at all. That's good. So let's mount them now. So to do that, I'm going to do a sudo, and we use the command mount. Now we don't have to specify what type of mount it's going to be, but we can, and I will. So -t is the type of mount point, or the type of file system it is. We've created an ext4, and we need to specify the device and then the mount point. Enter. Do that again. Now I've just created two mount points, data and downloads, to change it up a bit, and I've pointed my SDB1 to data and my SDB2 to downloads. Let's now have a look at both those and see what's inside them. And now I've got this lost and found directory, which is quite normal. That's a standard thing with Windows. When something gets lost, it gets put into that location, and there it is there. So we're almost done. Last thing we need to do is just make sure that we can write into the directories, and so we're going to do that using a little utility called touch. And we want to just create a file, and we'll put into data, and we'll call this one tester1 or 01. Sudo and we'll chuck this one into downloads. Call this one tester2. Let's have another look. And now we've got that new file in downloads and a new file in data. So that's great, that's worked. We've managed to create a new partition or partitions. We've applied a file system using mke2fs, and we've managed to mount those partitions and add files. The last thing we want to do is just go through the process of unmounting and deleting those partitions, just so we know how to do that. So if I go back into parted and go to delete the partitions, you'll find that I'll get an error if I try and do it before I unmount. If I try and delete both those partitions prior to unmounting those two mount points that I've created, then I'll get an error when I try to delete this. To delete a partition, you just use rm for remove and the number of the partition. So let's try and remove one, and it gives me that error, so I need to unmount it first. So I do want to go through that process, so I would type in mr1, enter, and then mr2, enter, and I will be able to unmount them. But before I do that, let's go back out. Let's do a sudo umount. So it's just be mindful of that. There's no n there, so it's not unmount, it's umount, and I want to just unmount data and downloads. So now if I have a look at both those directories that are living on my root, there's nothing inside them, and that's simply because it no longer references the two partitions that we created. So that's great. So they have been successfully unmounted. So let's do a sudo parted, and we'll select the right drive, print, and there's my two partitions, RM1, no news is good news, RM2, oh, space 2. We'll print the partitions, and they're both gone. So there you go. Hope this is useful, and look forward to seeing you in class next time. Cheers guys.